Quick backtrack to the War of the Worlds, the very famous broadcast by Orson
You
Welles.
want that light on?
Well, you know what? Let me see what it's like off. It's rather. That might be a little. Maybe just slightly. Let's see.
There we go. The other light
Yeah,
is
it's. Yeah,
a bit harsh.
it is. Okay. Let's go back to the War of the Worlds broadcast. And where were you and what was the
Okay.
reaction?
All right.
And when that was?
We used to love Orson Welles' Mercury Theater on the air because he would do things. My favorite, I was a kid, 10 or 11, and I loved Jane Eyre. He would at least do that once every other year. And that was my first exposure to Jane Eyre. And anyway, the most famous broadcast of all, we missed it. And I think, all I can think is we must have been at a Halloween party because neighbors used to have Halloween parties all the time. And I didn't know anything about it because there was no TV or 24-hour news in those days until I went to school the next day and everybody was talking about it. And that was the War of the Worlds. And we were just, none of us watched or heard it, in our family. We were just devastated because, as you know, it became a world-famous event. It's still
missing,
a world-famous event.
It's like missing the moon landing or something.
Right,
It's
just about
yeah.
every October it comes up again,
Yes.
the famous Orson Welles newscast thing.
Radio
I've heard
drama.
reruns of it, so it sounded, but we kept saying, all of my brothers and sister and I, if we had listened, we would have known it was a hoax.
But of course.
Because they interrupted
Being
it
Harpers.
and said, this is a play, they did say that. But I think people who didn't listen other than, the fact that there was some invasion from Mars and they didn't really pay much attention to what else was said during the broadcast. So we said we would have known.
I wasn't aware that they actually had disclaimers.
Yeah,
That
yeah.
shows how powerfully
They
done
did.
it must have, that people were somehow managed to not hear that.
Right. Well, now they claim, this was in 1936, I think. Wait a minute, 1938. I was in 6th grade. And one of the things they said, and I wasn't even aware of that, was that, World War II was imminent. And things were happening in Europe that had people on edge. So I wasn't aware of that. Anyway, that's my famous War of the Worlds, we missed it story.
Okay. Okay, so now we're I think where we ended was the summer of '45, a very
Right, after I
monumental
graduated
summer.
from
Right.
high school. Mm-hmm. And I was down in West Virginia Wesleyan, because the Air Force had this program where they trained recent high school graduates to become engineering aides at Wright Field, which was not too far from Springfield. My sister had gone through it 2 years earlier and had a job at Wright Field before she went to college, and she was a lab assistant in the aeronautical lab, where they were experimenting with space travel, actually. They were traveling
Wow.
with gravity, experimenting with, they had a tank that the men would get into, and they would simulate the atmosphere, going up in the atmosphere. They had all kinds of stuff. Anyway, that's where she did it, and it was a good program. So I went down to West Virginia Wesleyan to be trained as an engineering aide, and fortunately, they focused for me on drafting. And the war ended that summer, and I was in this little town in West Virginia, little college town, and everybody went wild. We went downtown, and the streets were just full of people shouting on VE Day, which was about my birthday.
I believe that, yes, I think that
I keep thinking it was the 14th.
I think Victory in Japan Day was your 18th birthday.
VJ Day, that's
VJ
what I meant.
Day was
VJ
your
Day,
14th,
because
18th
VE Day we'd
birthday.
already had in
So
April.
were you 17? I mean, more or less,
I
almost
was
18.
just turned 18.
But I mean, before, when you went down to this little place to work.
I was just a few months away from my 18th
Okay.
birthday. And I really liked it down there. It was a beautiful little town. I used to go home with people on their weekends.
And how did you get there? Was this by train?
Took a train. Yeah, it took all day. I mean, I took a train as far as Clarksburg, and then I had to take a bus to Buckhannon. And it was really fun. I was homesick the first week, and then from then on I was fine.
Where did you stay?
In a dorm. My roommate was in her 20s, and I can't even remember her name, but she was interesting. And most of the people there were just recently out of high school. There were some older people in their 20s there. But the war ended, and fortunately I had focused on drafting. So when we graduated at the end of summer, only about 5 of us actually had jobs. The rest of them, there were no jobs available because the war had ended. So I ended up working at Wright Field in the what was it called? Radio and Radar Lab or something. I don't know, but it was just drafting, and I did that for a year.
Now, Wright Field, that was in Dayton, correct?
In Dayton.
So
yeah.
in other words, then you finished up your job in West Virginia,
Well, the training. Finished the training in West
I
Virginia,
see.
and I commuted when I got home. My mother had worked at the field. My sister had worked at the field. We called it the field. And a neighbor had a carpool, and he drove everybody. And I worked there for a year, and by that time the servicemen were coming back, people who'd worked there before the war. And so my job ended, and I came back, and I started working at Springfield at the newspaper in the classified advertising. And all this time I was saving money for college, because my father couldn't afford to send us all to college, so we worked, all of us worked. My brother only had to work a year because he got a job in a factory and made lots of money, and then went to college in Auburn. And then when the war started, I think the war started before he went to college, that's right, but he enlisted after his freshman year and ended up going to college again. They put him in college.
Oh.
Anyway.
Yale, right? Or
Yeah.
Was that when he went to? Okay.
ASTP, it was called Army Service Training Program, and he went to Yale for 2 years and then to Long Island College of Medicine to finish 4 years. My sister, when I left for, when I was working, I'm trying to think, she worked for a year at Wright Field and then went to Duke. She ended up going to Duke University for 2 years, that's right. And by the time I left for college, she was coming home without a degree, but very bright, and got a job in a lab, chemistry lab.
She was a chemistry major,
Right.
correct? Okay.
Anyway, so I worked at the newspaper until I was ready to go to university, and I
And
selected Kent State.
What was your job at the
Classified
newspaper?
advertising.
Ah,
We
okay.
just took phone, people called in and had, pigs for sale or that kind
Was
of
it
stuff.
fun working in a newspaper?
Yeah, it was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
It was a lot of fun. And it was at home, so I could just go back and forth on the bus.
Okay.
Anyway, I enjoyed that, and enjoyed the people. And they called me the Bobby Soxer, because I wore socks. I didn't wear hose, I was dressed like a kid.
Well, you were a kid. When
And
you
I
think
looked
about
about
it.
12 anyway.
Yes.
So anyway, then I came to Kent State. I chose it because my uncle Bill, who lived in Kent, played up their art department, and that's what I was interested in. And it was very cheap, so I could afford it.
Do you remember how much it cost?
$30 a quarter for what they called a matriculation fee, and I think the dorms were, I don't know, the dorms were like maybe $200 a quarter, but maybe not that much. But that included 3 meals a day plus your room. And so it was very inexpensive. And
Now, you told me, which is fascinating to not only my generation, but the current generations, that you had never even set foot in Kent State
no.
before you just showed up on a train on a fall
of us,
day.
All my brothers and my older brother and sister and I all used my father's trunk, shipped it ahead of time with our stuff in it. My parents never saw this university, or while I was in it, or Duke, or Auburn. My father had gone to Auburn, but I mean they never. We just went off on the train with stuff, and there were a lot of people who were from this area who came to Kent State, and their parents would come on weekends, or they'd go home on weekends. But so the dorms were kind of empty on weekends because they'd go back to their high school football games. Well, good grief.
Rather provincial.
Anyway,
Tell me just about arriving at Kent. I love the story of you just arriving. It's
I
very
came on the
cinematic.
train, and
And what year was this?
This was 1947 in September. Classes started in September in those days, not August. And I got a cab to go up to campus. Now my trunk was being shipped by Railway Express, and that would be shipped right to the dorm. So I got a cab, and the guy said, "I guess we'll be seeing you at the Moon nightclub." And I said, "I'd never go to a nightclub." And the Moon nightclub was Mandelari's or Mandy's, where I spent quite a bit of time later.
He knew.
So I'd never seen the campus. I'd only seen a overhead photograph of it. I didn't realize how hilly it was. To me, it looked, it was really a beautiful campus, and it still is.
Still is.
But the dorm was built, I think it was the first women's dorm was built before 1920, I think. It went back pretty. It was very nice. Had a beautiful lounge. My first roommate was Beatrice Jane Seeley, who had come to Kent the year before and had a nervous breakdown.
Oh dear.
And this was her second try. So her family would come down every weekend and sit in the room, and I would leave. And I don't know what her problem was, but anyway, she
Somebody
didn't
applied.
stay. She finally left.
It was the day and age. It was the bell jar time period.
And the house mother sort of scolded me that I could have been nicer to her. I said I was nice to her. It's not my fault, that she left again. She was like, she had a phobia about something, I guess.
She had social anxiety disorder.
Social anxiety disorder, exactly. And then I got a roommate who was Joan, was her name. Was her name Joan? God, I can't even remember her name now. But anyway, she was a lot of fun. She was nuts, but fun, and not a very good student. And we stayed roommates for a couple of years, actually. And I met, one of the girls I met somewhere introduced me to this boy named Dick from Hudson, who was really nice, and we dated most of my freshman year. And
This must have been your first boyfriend, really,
He was.
except you
He
said
really
you didn't
was,
date in high
yeah.
school.
And anyway, what was I going to say about that? I don't know. I just had a lot of fun.
What
And
were the rooms like? Can you remember?
They
the
were
setup?
not terribly small. We had bunk beds
Mm-hmm.
and a dresser each, I think. And it was an old dorm. It wasn't fancy at all.
This was Molten Hall, you said.
Molten Hall,
Wow.
yeah, which is now a distance learning building. And I used to see John Burdell with my friend Jean Beckman. They were good friends. He was a journalism major then, and so was she. And she introduced me to him in a cafeteria line one day. And I always got him confused with a guy named Tom Davy, who looked just like him. They looked like twins. They both wore horn-rimmed glasses, and they were tall and thin. But I had this boyfriend, Dick Morrow, and he was just out of the Navy, and he'd saved up his money, and he had ordered a brand new car, because the cars were I don't think there were any new cars until 1947. And he was driving a 1938 car that was falling apart. And I remember we went up to Cleveland to hear Louis Armstrong at Severance Hall. And that was when he had his group that were just really great. And the first time I'd ever been to Severance Hall, of course, which was beautiful. And what else did we do? I think we went over to hear Glenn Miller's band. Glenn Miller disappeared over the English Channel during World War II. And his saxophone player was Tex Beneke, and he had taken over the band. And it was still called the Glenn Miller Band, and I remember going to that. And in those days, for homecoming, we'd have some big name band would come for homecoming, and it was usually in the gym. And anyway, it's hard to talk about everything because
Sure, I know, it's a very rich
the
time.
first year.
Tell me about meeting Anne Duvall. I love that story.
Oh, I didn't meet her for years.
Oh, I thought
didn't
that
meet
was
her
your
right
freshman
away. Well,
year.
I mean, no, I
When
didn't
she
meet
said,
Ann
"Does
until I
anyone-"
was. I think I was a junior.
Oh, I thought you
Or was I?
meant...
No, I was a sophomore. I was
Okay.
a sophomore.
Well, I'm
Yeah,
skipping
when I
ahead
met
then.
her, it was during a break in an art class. Those were 2-hour art classes, so you got a little break after the first hour. And she came strolling down the hall, and she wasn't pretty, but she was very attractive. And we were leaning up against the wall chatting, the guys and I, and she walked over and said, "Does anybody around here know anything about anything?" And I just said, "What do you want to know?" She was from a very wealthy family, and she'd been kicked out of every private school in northeastern Ohio, I think. And was starting.
Tell me about her father too.
No, it was her grandfather. Her
sorry.
grandfather. They were from a little place called Berlin Heights, only they pronounced it Berlin because of the war. And her grandfather had tried to start a commune which would produce super race people. And I didn't know that much, anything more about it. But she was what we used to call fast. You know, she was no virgin and hadn't been for some time, I'm assuming. And anyway, she later became my roommate, which was funny. And she was a great roommate. I really enjoyed her. She'd tell me about all her escapades while I tried to keep my jaw from dropping. Because one time she was talking about she'd gone to a party in Cleveland and with all the arty people up there. And she said, and there was this young virgin there. You know how young virgins are. And I said, yes, I do.
Very well.
But that was when I lived off campus. I lived 2 years in the dorms. First I lived in Moulton, and then I lived in Lowry Hall. And I had two roommates, Barbara Lightfoot and Joan. What the hell was her last name? Oh, anyway. She was from Alliance, yeah.
You also told a story about how it was everyone. You thought it was supposed to be the happiest years of your life. All the people.
Oh, that
crying.
was when I was in Moulton Hall my freshman year. I was most people left on weekends, and so the dorms were pretty empty. But I remember walking down this hall and hearing people, at least 3 women, sobbing behind closed doors, and thinking these are supposed to be the happiest days of our lives, and hear all these women sobbing. It was spring, you know, probably they'd been dumped by their boyfriends.
You would wander. I remember you telling me something about a cigarette holder a day.
Oh,
you
Adele
were bored.
Halter.
Yes.
Adele and I were friends in our freshman year. She was neat. She was from, some little town. Anyway, we went downtown at one of those bare weekends when no one was around, and there used to be a drugstore, Standard Drugstore, which was in the building that burned down 40 years ago. Anyway, they were selling cigarette holders, and we each got one and, walked around looking sophisticated with our cigarette holders. And in those days, Friday was a beer day. You went downtown and
what
drank
were the
beer.
What were the bars where you?
The
would drink
bars,
beer?
there was the Rathskeller in the building that burned down.
Mm-hmm.
That was also a restaurant. And then Mandy's, which was the Mandalary's. Carper's, which is where the loft is now. Mandy's was probably the most popular. And the Venice. We went to the Venice.
What about Ray's place?
Ray's was where you went for pizza. They made it on Saturday nights, and you could buy it by the slice. And it's the first pizza anywhere, I think. The guys who owned Ray's had been in Italy during the war, and they came back and they decided to make pizza. But they only served it on Saturday nights.
So that was quite
and you
the
wouldn't
novelty
buy a whole
then.
one, you'd
right.
buy a piece.
Was that quite a novelty then, to have a slice of pizza?
Yeah, because nobody had ever heard of it around
So
here.
hard to imagine,
In fact,
yeah.
when we moved to Columbus after we were married, there was only one pizza place in all of Columbus.
Amazing.
It was so rare. But
So tell me more about meeting John Burnell.
okay, I met him. I told you my friend Gene Beckman introduced us. Well, that was my sophomore year, I guess, because I went with Dick my whole first year, I think. Or was it till the end of the year? Anyway, I got ticked off at him for some reason or other, and there was a dorm dance, that was it. And you could invite boys, and I thought, well, John Burnell looks like a neat guy. I'd talked to him a few times. So I invited him to the dance, and I never went out with Dick again. But I think that was over anyway,
Yeah.
You fall in love with somebody for the first time, and then it's over.
So
I
do
didn't
you
know if I
remember
was in
little
love with
details like what you wore to the dance?
My mother sent me this terrible dress. I mean, I was so skinny,
How much did you weigh about?
about 90. I don't know if I
Yeah.
even weighed 90. I was
And you
really
were 5'7",
skinny.
so yeah.
Really skinny. And that wasn't the day that skinny was good.
Sure.
I had straight hair
This
when
is
curly hair
pre-heroin
was in.
chic, yes.
And, I could just have lived in Audrey Hepburn's era.
Yes, I know.
Or Twiggy.
Yes.
Anyway, so it was this sort of pale blue, drapey, it was this drapey stuff. I probably looked like a scarecrow in it. I don't know. I hated it. But,
The shoes. Didn't you have some black suede
oh, my
pumps?
black suede shoes they were platform shoes, sling pumps, that everybody borrowed when they wanted to look good. And I loved clothes, so I had gotten myself some really nice clothes for school. And, wow, let me think. Well, that was the first date I had with John Burnell. And the phone just rang, and I'm going to answer
Okay,
it.
I'll stop it. Okay. Back to, so you went to this dance with John Burnell,
Right.
and do you remember that first date? What it was like?
Not really.
Yeah.
I really don't.
The date
I remember when we started, we didn't really start, I just don't remember now whether I started dating him at the end of my freshman year. I'm pretty sure it was. Or maybe, yeah, I know I was dating him when I was a sophomore living in Lowry Hall.
But when was the time did you feel like a real connection to him? Like this is
Oh
somebody you
yeah,
had a lot
I
in
really
common.
liked him right off the bat. And I remember he had a class at this certain area, and I would manage to be hanging out near that classroom building and accidentally run into him, meanwhile cutting my own class. But anyway, I don't remember. I just remember one date, I think it was early on. We went out to the big house, which is in Brady Lake, and had a really nice little dance floor and a fireplace. And I remember we sat there and talked about cats for hours. Girls had to be in by 10:30 on weeknights and 12 o'clock on weekends. So you couldn't spend a lot of, you couldn't just relax and take your time. But anyway, and my best friend in those days was Colleen Gall, and her date was Chuck Fletcher, and he was also a journalism major. So he and John knew each other. And we had a great time together. We really had fun. And I'll never forget one time we'd been to some dance and had a bit to drink, and this music came on the car radio. Colleen had a car. She was one of the few co-eds who had a car. And she just stopped the car, and we all got out and danced in the road. That was such fun.
And I remember you telling me that story. You said, I was horrified because I just kept imagining, you'll get hit by a car, but you said there weren't a lot of cars on
That's
the road
right. It was a
back
back
then.
road, for one thing. It was a little 2-lane road, which every road was in those days. There were very few 4-lane roads around, there are the way there are now. But anyway, that was then. And then I switched my major from art to sociology, and John switched his major from journalism to sociology about the same time.
Now,
We
why
both
was
took this
that?
one
I
class
see.
that we really liked, the guy, and so we ended up. And I had all but sculpture in my major for art, and that was the only thing that made it a minor. But I majored in sociology, and I won the sociology prize my senior year, which was a check for $25, which I spent on paying back up to everybody I had borrowed money from. And
You also took a lot of psychology classes, didn't you?
I minored in psych,
Yeah.
actually, yeah, because I met Wes Zahner, and Wes was a psych major, and I don't know how I met him. I know we went up to there used to be an asylum in Sagamore Hills for mentally ill people. And I took abnormal psych, and of course I had every disease in it. But he arranged the students to go up to this asylum, and they put on a show for us. I was cruel, I thought. They would bring these patients out and ask them questions that they knew would have crazy answers. So anyway, Wes drove that day. He was the one who drove up there. And we became really good friends. And he encouraged me to take more psych classes because there were too many men and he wanted more women, even though this was after John had graduated and I was here by him myself, more or less. But he was dating a girl in Akron, so we weren't dating or anything. We were just really good friends. And so anyway, yeah.
You also got a scholarship of some sort.
I did get a scholarship, didn't I? Yeah. Oh, yeah. Which just covered tuition. Didn't cover dorm and eating and all that. That's why I moved off campus. Because I could pay monthly for my, I didn't have to come up with $200 the beginning of the quarter.
Right.
like, you know, rooms were like $2 a week in those days. And where John lived, they had a kitchen in the basement, and the lady let them use the kitchen. There were 5 or 6 guys in that house, and they took turns cooking, and one guy did all the shopping because he was an econ major. And then we all took turns cooking, and I was the only girl. They voted me in because I had eaten with them a few times, and they let me. And they were all excited because I was a girl and I could cook, but I couldn't. So,
They just assumed. This was on University
University
Drive, correct?
Drive. And I lived at 117, and I think John lived at 207 or something.
So you were on the same street.
We were on the same street, a few houses. That whole street was rooming houses.
It must have been wonderful, actually.
It
I'm
was
just
fun.
imagining
It
it.
was fun, yeah.
The you lived in a house with how many other girls?
I think there were mostly there 2, 4, about 8 or 9, maybe 10. And some of them were freshmen, and that's when Ann Duvall became my roommate. And she was my roommate for a year, and then I had a freshman for my last year, a really nice girl who was a biology major. And that was a neat bunch of girls, and there were, Ann stayed my friend forever until she moved to New Jersey. She didn't live here. Never mind. She married a guy from Kentucky and lived in Louisville, and then she ended up back in this area, and we reconnected and stayed
She was
friends.
an actress, right?
She was a painter and an actor and director, and she was really good. And she was a lot of fun and very unconventional.
There was a story, too, about some, I believe, Japanese girls in your dorm?
Oh, they were in my freshman dorm. What's her name? Setsuko and Kameo.
Mm-hmm.
Kameo's grandmother had an orchid farm in Hilo, and they were very nervous when they came here because the war was only over for 2 years, and they
Sure.
were Japanese. They were Hawaiian, but they were Japanese.
Mm-hmm.
And they became they were really neat and friendly and shy at first, but Kameo would, every time a dance was coming up, she'd have her grandmother send a big box of orchids for everybody for corsages. And it turned out, didn't I tell you that Mitzi knew them?
No.
Because they were from Hilo.
Oh,
Vixie,
wow.
I mean. Yeah, she knew Setsuko and Kameo.
But just jumping back
Okay.
really quickly about the internment camps during World War II with the Japanese, Americans were aware of those, correct? It was,
I think, but there was so much prejudice.
yeah.
I mean, the editorial cartoons were always, they made them look like monsters, big teeth, and then in the movies they were always gunning down Americans while giggling. I mean, it was
Right,
just awful,
right.
awful stuff. And I think that they probably Setsuko and Kameo had been interned in Hawaii. It wasn't a state yet, but they were still, it was a territory of the United States. And
Yeah, I think that was something that was kept very undercover when I was in school
don't-
because
yeah.
I was never taught it in school.
no, we knew it. We knew
Yeah.
about it. I think people felt they deserved it
Yeah.
because they were strange. They weren't Aryan. They weren't like us.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't know anything about what they had done to China in the 20s and 30s. I had no idea about that, but apparently they had done some brutal, vicious, horrible things. And I never forget a movie with these women in it. They were nurses in the Pacific, and the Japanese invaded the island wherever they were. And I'll never forget, this one woman volunteered to walk toward this group of Japanese soldiers, and she was carrying a hand grenade. And she walked toward them and then blew them all up, and everybody cheered. She sacrificed herself for the rest
Wow.
of the women. Because there's only one thing Japanese men were going to do, and that was rape every
right.
American woman they could get their hands
But
on.
of course,
I mean, this propaganda was just
yeah.
awful. But at the time, it didn't seem that way, because they had bombed Pearl Harbor, and the adult people knew about what they had done in China, so there was a lot of fear and hatred. And it seems strange now, I mean, we
Sure.
hated the Germans, too, because they were going to do the same thing. But
But getting back to movies
Yeah.
on a much lighter note, you remember when Lauren Bacall made her debut as well.
yes, I remember reading about Howard Hawks
She was a
discovering
tall,
her.
skinny girl.
I know. She was my role model, and yeah, I never forget that movie and her
You
voice.
weren't you babysitting and someone came home or maybe there was some story where somebody said you've just got to go see that movie.
Oh no, that's another story. That's later,
okay.
much later.
Okay.
That was about the Manchurian Candidate.
Ah,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so we can lead up to that.
We
Now,
can lead up to that.
another thing I wanted to ask you about was television came out, I believe, in around 1948,
Yeah,
correct? For
I
the
think,
general
something
public.
like that.
And I believe you told me something about some sort of lounge, maybe the Student Union, where there was the
Oh
first
yeah,
TV
we
up at
would
campus.
go. We would go every Friday night. There were the Gillette fight nights, and everybody would go and watch the fights on television because there were some very colorful fighters, like Sugar Ray Robinson and Rocky Graziano, and now that I think about it, why would I want to go and watch a fight? But
Yeah,
it
it
was
doesn't
fun,
sound
and it
like
was
it.
TV, and you could see it.
How did it feel seeing that little screen and just how did it feel
Oh, it was
compared
amazing.
to movies?
It was just amazing. Black and white and probably fuzzy, I don't know, but you could see things. And yeah, TV was very. My parents were very late to get a TV set, but other people had. The Brunels, of course, had one early on because Mr. Brunel loved technology, so he had one.
So there was pretty much just this from one TV in the Student Union at Kent State, or were there a few where people could watch
There was
things?
one, and it
One
was in
TV.
like a lounge area. There was always the same people. It was like date night. I mean, there were always these couples there watching the fights. That's all we watched were the Gillette fights, Friday night fights.
Now, where did you, when you went into town, besides drinking beer and having pizza at Ray's, were there any little restaurants
Oh, we
or
went to
diners
the
you went
movies
to?
all the time. We
Oh,
never went to a restaurant. We never ate out.
Okay. Well, you were
The
fed.
Robin Hood, we
Robin
ate
Hood?
at when I moved into the house. Robin Hood had a back section called the cottage room, and you could get a pretty decent meal for $1. So we did. A lot of us went there before I started eating with the guys, and then after John graduated, that's where I went. That and the Grid was a little restaurant behind the next to the Robin Hood on Lincoln Street. They had good breakfasts, and
And you started, I interrupted you, you started talking about movies. You went to the movies a lot?
we
Was
went
this
to the
at Kent
movies a
Theater?
lot.
And what stands out of favorite movies?
I think
know-
one of our favorite movies was Young Man with a Horn, which was sort of a fictionalized account of Bix Beiderbecke, and then now I answer the phone again or look at it.
Okay.
Anyway.
Okay.
It was called Young Man with a Horn, and Kirk Douglas was the young man with a horn. It was about this. It was one of those stories about a poor boy, trying to make good. Lauren Bacall was in it, I believe, as a bitch, and Doris Day was in it as a singer. And the music was so good in that movie that John bought me back in the old days, you bought an actual album, a thing with cardboard covers and record sleeves inside.
I had them too.
And he bought me that album for Christmas that year. It just became a favorite of ours.
There was also the Montgomery Clift.
Oh yeah, thank
Berlin
you for
and Rome.
reminding me. You
Yes.
could do this yourself, Yeah.
Tell me about that one, The Search.
Oh, that was heartbreaking. The Search. It was Montgomery Clift's first big movie that I knew of, and it was about he was a soldier in post-war Germany, and he found this little boy in the rubble. I mean, this kid kept watching him walk, and then he found him and took him home. The little kid couldn't speak English. Well, the sad part about it is this little boy had lost everybody and everything, and he kept trying to find his mother. An impossible task, this war-torn country. And Montgomery Clift kind of looked after him. But it was, all you could think of is how sad that was, that it was actually not just a movie, but this was happening over and over again in any of the war-torn countries. It was just so sad. And,
Plus, there were no special effects there. That was
No,
the Berlin
no.
rubble.
That's right.
It was shot because I saw it a few years ago, and it
Yeah.
was still just as powerful. I can't imagine seeing
Yeah.
it fresh after the war. Must have been pretty amazing.
And that little boy, those eyes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was a really good film, and people should see it now. I think
Yeah.
it's not going to wear,
No,
not
it
gonna
doesn't.
wear
It's not
out.
dated. Who were the big movie stars of that time period when you were
Well,
in
Bing
college?
Crosby and Bob Hope movies, the road movies were really big. The theater would be packed with those movies, and then the Looney Tunes cartoons were great. Um, what else was going on then? I don't remember. We just liked movies, and
Was there a feeling in the air of relief, happiness, what have you, that the World War II was over? I mean, that was
I
a
think so.
pretty
You
big-
know, and the Korean War came, and I didn't even know what was going on.
Yeah.
Even though I ran into this guy on campus who was dressed in an Air Force uniform, I mean, a student that I knew. I said, "What are you doing with that uniform on?" He said, I'm back in the Air Force." And he had been in the World War too, but he had re-enlisted. He might have been an officer. I don't know what he was. But I thought, what? You know,
Yeah, didn't
I
you
didn't
just
know
get
there
over
was
the
a
one
war
war?
on. And I didn't really know about it until I got out of school. I thought, oh, God, there's a war in Korea.
Mm-hmm.
But, and I remember people being really nervous. I remember John being really nervous that he'd get drafted again. You know, because
Sure, he was still young.
he was only in his early 20s, but
But you also said that a lot of the male students, when the male students at Kent State were older. For example, John was 5
Yeah.
years older than you. A lot of them were older because they were in the war, so
Yeah,
their
yeah.
time going to college had been delayed a bit.
right. Well, some of them had never even thought of going to college. You know, it was the day of GI Bill, and there were more men than women in school now then, and but they never talked about anything. I just remember one guy talking about toward the end of the war going on one final raid, and getting back when they landed, he just got down and kissed the ground because he figured they could have been that could have been it. They'd made it all the way through, and here's one last thing. And for all I know, it was bombing Erding. No, that was the Brits are the ones
I think
who
it was
bombed
yeah,
Erding.
yeah, Dresden.
But
Did
they didn't discuss it, and I'm sure there
yes.
were terrible things that had happened.
So
to
the
these
boys
young
didn't
people.
talk about it. They
No,
didn't. Yeah,
no,
yeah.
never.
Right.
You know, we talk about PTSD now, and if any of them had it, you know, you didn't know. But they called it being shell shocked in those days. But no, they were just so glad it was over, and they had this wonderful GI Bill, which not only was college, but loans for houses.
Wow.
You know, there were all kinds of benefits that they got, deservedly so, that
And
every
they-
soldier
right.
should get.
They lived in barracks on the
Well,
campus,
there was a
correct? Or
barracks,
some of
one
them?
big, that was there, not everybody lived in there, but
Where
it was,
did
it was where
Daddy
Whitehall
live?
is now.
Where did Daddy live?
He lived on University Drive at Mrs. Kernan's.
Oh, I see, the whole time.
because
I
his
gotcha.
cousin Van had lived there.
Ah, okay.
So he came here because his cousin was here. And
Now, were you the thing you always heard about people back then was pre-engagement sort of thing was to be pinned, get the boys' fraternity pinned.
well, sort of as a joke, your father joined a fraternity, just in name only, because the head of the department, John was the son he'd never had, even though he had a son,
And this was Dr.
and Mr. Dr. Lang,
Oh,
and
Lang,
he was
okay.
he was the member of that fraternity, and so he encouraged John. He said it'll be good for connections. You know, they didn't use the word networking in those days, but it's a good thing for him. So he kind of joined it, and he gave it to me, golly, after he was in grad school. So that was it. But they used to have these pinning ceremonies, and our dorm had a little chorus that we put together, and we would sing for everybody that got pinned. And I'll never forget this one girl had boobs out to here. She was Jane Russell, and the guy who was pinning her was an athlete, a star basketball player, and we almost died laughing when he went to pin that pin on her. He was fumbling, and we were
Nervous,
going, oh my
right.
God.
You were standing there singing while during the pinning
Yeah,
ceremony?
we had to sing.
I thought there was remember that sort of U-shaped willow tree up on campus right near Rockwell Hall?
yeah,
Wasn't
yeah.
that also a place where people would get
Not
pinned?
that I know of.
I thought I heard that
I
somewhere.
used to get my lunch at Stahl's Bakery across the street and sit on that tree to eat lunch in the spring, of course.
Now, I'm glad you mentioned that because that takes me to the sort of Cold War stuff and some of the people on campus.
Oh, right.
Those
This
men in
was, I don't know if
suits.
this was the Cold War or not.
I guess,
It was,
well, maybe it's sort of
it was the
pre-Cold
Red
War.
the Red Scare.
The Red Scare. Let's get into that
And we
now.
had a guy in Dr. Fleming's theory class, social theory class, which discusses all the great social philosophers from God only knows how long ago. one of whom was Karl Marx, of course. And this guy was in class. He had gray hair, and he always wore a business suit and black shoes. That was a big sign. And there were no really radical people on campus, although I did have one friend whose father had come to Akron from Hungary, and during when Hungary became communist, he took the whole family back to Hungary, and my friend was one of, that was his dad. But anyway, and he was kind of crazy, that guy, but after living in Hungary for a couple of years, he decided communism was not for him. Anyway, we had speakers on campus who were of all political stripes. I mean, you never, and it was fun. It was education. That's what you're here for, to get all kinds of different points of view. So anyway, this guy started joining us for our lunch on the campus and asking questions about, doesn't this professor talk an awful lot about Karl Marx? And we just laughed, and we said, you can't have a class in social theory without discussing Marx. And we never had seen him before, and that was my senior year, so I never saw him again. But we were convinced that he was from the FBI or one of those. Joe McCarthy was just starting to rise with his red baiting and his...
So was that the first inkling that you got that that there was a sort of paranoia growing among the general public, or at least among
I think among
certain...
Yeah, because at the same time, John was at Ohio State, and he had to take a loyalty oath before he could teach. He was a teaching assistant. He didn't think anything of it because he'd never been in anything. He used to say, I wish I'd belonged to something that was suspicious, but he never had been. At Ohio State, they had a gag rule. They wouldn't let certain speakers on campus because Ohio, there was the National Un-American Activities Committee. Ohio had its own committee and decided who was suspicious and who wasn't.
We're talking around 1950 or
Yeah,
so? When did you put it in?
Yeah, 1951. And I don't know how many years that lasted, 7 or 8, I think. But anyway, and then when I graduated, I heard from former professors, that there was a lot of people getting investigated, mostly political scientists and sociologists, and even historians, felt they were being persecuted by, never knowing who's in my class. But they went ahead and did what they did anyway. Nobody ever got arrested or called before the committee.
So before we get into a little bit more of this, so now it's around 1950, 51. So you graduated in 51, is that correct?
John graduated in 1950 and went straight to Ohio State to get his graduate degree.
And at that
point, I graduated in 1951.
And what did you become? Did you have an official engagement? Did you get an engagement ring or anything like that?
Not really. It just kind of happened.
Mm-hmm.
I just think it was like, let's get married kind of stuff that
Right.
he said. He didn't get down on his knees and ask me to marry him. He says,
Right.
I think we should get married or whatever. I don't remember.
So when he was in grad school, you were still an undergrad at Kent State. How often were you able to see each other?
Only a couple of times, because Mary Jane Cochran, who had been one of our psych profs, was then Mary Jane Rader. She'd married George Cochran, who was in the political science department. And George had gone back down to Ohio State to get a master's degree. He was much older, but he was teaching without a master's degree. So I remember one time we went down so she could see George and I could see John. So I only maybe saw him a couple of times that whole year, except at Christmas or Thanksgiving. I think he spent Thanksgiving with my family, that Thanksgiving of 1951, 51, 50, whatever. He was in Columbus and I was at Ohio State.
But you wrote letters to each other.
Oh, yeah, we wrote all the time.
Right.
And you didn't call in those days because it was long distance. But anyway, I graduated in 1951.
And before you even mentioned graduation, just really quickly, what did you like specifically about sociology? We know what you like about art. You've been a lifelong artist at that point.
Curiosity about how people behave, what goes on in society, and having some really stimulating professors who made you think. That's what I really liked, like Dr. Fleming. I mean, he was just...
Was there any particular area of sociology that can... I know in my father's case, it was race relations.
Race and
was
poverty,
what he ended up...
racism. I don't know. I think I was interested in that. I was just interested in the whole idea of examining how people work in groups and how things go with folks. I don't know. Folks, God, what is his name?
Okay. Just curious. So
Yeah.
so now it's 90. You graduate in 51. How did you feel upon graduation? Was it a
Oh, relief. I
Relief?
remember throwing my books in the air and just, I'm out of here. Because, it was fun, but it was still, constant work. And then I had money worries about how am I going to pay off that little
which
loan I
which
got.
leads me back to the little the scholarship you had. You said it was
That just
very
took care of-
stressful, but you said it was very stressful
Well, because I never had any trouble getting good grades until I had a scholarship. And I had to keep a 3-point average, which was no problem, except I flunked gym one time and it went below 3. So I came back to school anyway, wondering, what am I going to do? And I went to see the guy in charge, and I said, do I still have my scholarship? He said, oh, we don't count gym.
Thank God, as they
So I
shouldn't.
said, thank God. So,
But you went through a rather anxious time, you said, where you
well,
couldn't.
yeah, then when and just when you have to maintain an average, you worry about it more than when you don't. You know
Sure.
what I mean? It's just
Of course, it puts the pressure on. Like
uh,
LeBron coming back to Cleveland.
right, exactly. Expectations.
Right. So you graduate, and this I assume would have been summer of 51
It
around?
was June of
June
51,
of
and I did
51.
not go to graduation. I hated ceremony,
Really?
ritual. No, I didn't go.
Real?
My father was very upset, and I said, look, every year we'd either had a graduation or a wedding in our family in
Oh.
June, and I said, and I hate them. I don't like ceremony.
Did your sister get married in 51, June of
She
51?
got married in,
Or was,
wait a minute, 50? Yes, wait a minute.
just wondering if it coincided.
I'm trying to think when she got married. Billy got married in 49. I think she got married in 51, in June of 51.
Okay, so yeah, maybe you felt your parents were caught up in
Right,
planning a
right,
big
yeah,
Catholic wedding
yeah.
or something.
No, well, she
Uh,
didn't have a huge wedding.
okay.
She had a very sweet little wedding.
Okay.
So anyway, we did that. No, I think she got married in 1950. God, how can I forget that?
Well, if you
Anyway,
you would remember it if
they
you,
just had their 60th wedding anniversary a couple of years ago.
yeah.
Anyway,
So you graduate, and then did you?
then I got a job at the hospital. They did not have a social service department yet, but they were going to open one in the fall. It was a brand new hospital, Mercy Hospital. So I got a job as a switchboard operator, which was fun. And
And this was in
I
Springfield?
think John was in West Virginia that summer working on his master's.
This was Springfield?
Springfield,
okay.
yeah, Mercy Hospital in
Okay.
Springfield. And then that fall, while I was operating the switchboard, some nuns came in to visit a fellow nun, and one of them had been one of my favorite teachers. And she said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I graduated in June with a degree in sociology, and I'm waiting for them to open a social service department so I can be a social worker." She said, "I need a 3rd grade teacher." And I thought, well, that sounded pretty good. So I did that. And then I was in Springfield. John was in Columbus. So we saw each other quite a bit. He either came to Springfield or I took a bus over to,
And
to Columbus.
what's the distance of those two
it's
cities?
like, an hour bus ride.
Oh, okay.
And
And at that point, you were pretty much knew you were going to get married, right? Or did you?
I don't know. I didn't think
assume.
about it.
Really?
I think if I do get married, that's who I'm going to marry.
Okay.
But I didn't think about
Okay.
anything specific. But anyway, so
So you taught 3rd grade for a year?
a year, yeah. I had 37 kids. I had no idea what I
my
was doing.
God, were you given instructions on how to teach? Did
No.
Really?
But I
They
had a
just sort of
degree.
thought-
It was a Catholic school.
Yeah.
They'll hire you if you got any kind
But
of
you have to
degree.
do math and science.
Well, it was 3rd grade.
Sure.
Who could not do that? But my roommate, at that point, had been an education major in my last year in college, and she was one of the top education students in her class. So I wrote to her. I said, "Okay, what do I do?" She wrote back, "I'm in an inner city school in Cleveland. I have no idea what to do." She said I could have been majoring in basket weaving for all the good it's doing me. So anyway, she didn't have any advice for me because really, she was from a little town in Ohio, and her name was Kay, and she was really neat and fun. And here suddenly she's in the inner city of Cleveland, you know. All her education had been aimed at white middle-class kids.
Sure. Which takes me back to yet another point. What was the black population, if at all, at Kent State when you were there?
Very small, very small. In our freshman dorm, there was one black student. I don't think there were any black students. I don't know. I think she didn't come back for sophomore year. She was really neat, too. She was really smart. She was from Cleveland. Bill Workman, who I still have seen recently, was a fellow art student. He was terrific. Everybody liked Bill. He was also the model, the black model that Mr. Morrow took white paint and outlined as deltoids for us. Bill was a dancer and an artist, and he ended up teaching in Cleveland,
Nice.
teaching art in Cleveland. Neat guy.
Was Oscar Ritchie there at the time?
Oscar Ritchie was the first black professor in a state university in Ohio.
And who was the president who hired him at the time? Was
Dr.
that
Bowman, George Bowman, who back in the old days, he had come to Kent. He'd been a superintendent in some county school system somewhere. Everybody adored that man, and he knew every student. They lived on campus, you know, in that old president's house.
Boy, have times changed.
Yeah.
How, just also getting back to this race thing, because Daddy at this point was in grad school, and is that when he was starting to get into the whole race relations
Yeah.
topic, more at Ohio State than at Kent State?
Yeah,
Or-
well, he was interested at Kent.
And again, how did he get
He had
interested in
gotten
that?
into it because when he was in the Army, he was stationed in Louisiana and Texas and Oklahoma, and he was a military policeman I think in Louisiana or someplace. He saw how black people were treated, and he just outraged. He was outraged by it, and so he always had an interest as an adult in that. And then when he went to Ohio State, Dr. Berry was his advisor, and he was working on a study of groups that were considered black, but were so mixed that they didn't consider themselves black. They were mixed with white, they were mixed with Native American, and several states had these groups of people, and in West Virginia they were called guineas, and they were in a certain section of West Virginia. And Dr. Berry, since John was from West Virginia, said, "Why don't you do your master's thesis on the guineas?" And so he did. That's what he was working on. And then, well, I won't get to that yet, but
Okay. Yes, we have many stories on that.
I
So
know it's
you're-
such a drag, but
it's
anyway.
not a drag. It's absolutely fascinating. So we can speed it up slightly. You taught third grade. You survived that.
I
and
survived that. Didn't know what
and
the hell I was doing.
Daddy was getting his master's. How
Right.
but did it take 2 years to get his master's?
No, he had already been down there for a year.
Oh, correct. When you were married,
And then we
he
got
was still
married
a grad
the
student.
end of my teaching year.
Okay.
Second year, the first year after I graduated, we got married in '52. In a very small wedding. We didn't want a big
And
thing.
you didn't have a Catholic wedding because was it because he
Well,
was
I had a
Methodist?
priest marry us,
Okay.
but to go through the whole thingy, John would have had to go to classes on Catholicism and all that shit.
And he was
And
Methodist.
I found a priest who worked at the hospital as the chaplain, who said, "I know somebody." He said, "I can't marry you, but I know somebody who can." And he said, "And he won't make you won't put your fiance through all that stuff." So we got married in the rectory of St. Bernard's Church in Springfield, with just my parents there and my brothers, I think.
And he had a best man, or maybe they were just
Ed Dager and what's her name? Ed's wife. Esther.
Now,
Esther
where was Ed
the
from?
maid of honor.
He
Ed was from Warren. He and Daddy had been roommates in grad school.
But
He had gone to Kent State. They recognized, and he was also a social major. When they ended up at Ohio State, they recognized each other. They didn't know each other well, but they found a room with John's former roommate at Kent on University Drive.
And
Donald
what
Ermatinger.
was his ancestry? Was it Lebanese or
Oh,
Syrian?
Dager was Syrian.
Syrian.
Oh, no, wait a minute. Syrian or Lebanese, one of those two.
Okay. Right.
Nice, terrific guy, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so now you get married, and then
We moved to a little house in Worthington,
Mhm.
and John continues in grad school. I got a job at the university in the registrar's office. And we just, hung out with fellow grad students.
And this was again when the McCarthyism was starting to pick up
yeah,
a little bit more.
McCarthyism was rampant.
So please tell me about this because this is
Okay.
fascinating.
Well, what was scary about it is the Ohio Un-American Activities Committee took it upon itself to, first of all, force all people teaching at Ohio State to take a loyalty oath that they'd never been a member of the Communist Party. They investigated everything. One of the young men who was a grad student in geography took over the Film Society, which, like Kent State used to have, a film
Sure,
series.
yeah.
And he happened to have a couple of films by people who were on the Hollywood 10 list, which doesn't mean anything. They were all good movies,
Of course,
They were
right.
not going to show Betty Grable movies at a university.
Right.
So thoughtful movies like The Oxbow Incident and The Third Man and all those kinds of really good films. And so this poor guy gets called in to the Ohio Un-American Activities Committee because he used a film that wasn't his, that was on the list, the famous list. We had a friend, Hal, who was a nervous wreck, and I found out like much later that he had been a communist when he was 16. Poor Jewish kid in Rhode Island. Communism sounded pretty good to him.
Sure.
But of course he had taken the loyalty oath, and if they'd ever discovered it when he was teaching at Ohio State,
Yeah.
he would have been fired. It was just a terrible time because, like Hal said, you'd go to a party, and for all you knew, there was somebody there who was, a mole who would probably, if you mentioned something, if you mentioned something about your past, it would get reported to somebody, and you'd be out on your rear. So it was a really awful time. And then, of course, Ed Murrow did his great challenge to McCarthy. And I remember we didn't have a TV set. I remember standing outside a TV store with a crowd.
I always saw that in movies.
With a TV
Yeah.
going with Edward R. Murrow getting at McCarthy. And then, of course, by the time we had bought our own TV set, the Army McCarthy hearings were on. I was glued to it 24 hours a day, practically.
Didn't you say you and Daddy wished you were tempted to join the Communist Party
Well,
just
that's
to
what
make
he
it?
said. Yeah.
Yeah. What did he say?
Oh no, he's the one that said it. He
Yeah.
says, I've never belonged to anything, But
Just a sort of spite, or to out of spite to do
right,
something like that. Yeah.
But
So tell me about the hearings.
the
Watching that
hearings
must
were
have been
wonderful
compelling.
because McCarthy he always held up, I have a list here of communists, and there was never anything on it apparently, but he accused the Army of harboring communists. And then the Army said, well, you don't mess with us, buddy, And of course, General Eisenhower was the president then, and you don't mess with his army. So they had this hearing. It was sort of like the Watergate hearings, with endless questioning. And so that was the end of McCarthy because he would accuse people just flat out without anything at all. And he accused one of the what's the word I want? The prosecuting attorney, so to speak, that's not the real title, was Joseph Welch, who was this wonderful old Dickensian character who was head of a big law firm in Boston. And McCarthy, during the hearings, accused one of his young attorneys of being a communist. And that was it. And that's the famous speech. Have you no shame? At long last, have you no shame? And it just is, I wish I could quote it verbatim. It's a wonderful speech.
I'm sure it's on YouTube.
It is. Joseph
Yeah.
Welch, McCarthy hearings. And that was the end of McCarthy, really. I mean, people just suddenly went, wait a minute,
Yeah.
He can just say this about anybody and everybody believes. Everybody was terrified of this man. And you think about Eisenhower, it came out much, 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 much later that he had an affair when he was, in Europe with some woman. Nobody ever knew that or cared about it, but I'm thinking, no wonder McCarthy never stepped in, because either Edgar Hoover or McCarthy could dig up something that would be
Sure.
bad. So it was just amazing to watch that old man. He was my hero for the rest of his life. I think he was just great. But anyway, that ended that, and then when we came back to Kent. I'm skipping ahead for a reason. We met Sid and what's her name, Jackson, the Jacksons.
Jackie Jackson? Or?
No, his wife,
Clara,
who had been blacklisted and had been unemployed for about 5 years because of communism. They grew up in a communist settlement in New York City. Their parents were garment workers. And it was okay to be a communist in those days, it was just another party. Well, when that came out, apparently sometime during Sidney's employment somewhere, he lost his job, Clara lost her job.
Do you think that anti-Semitism played a role in this?
Not for them.
Okay, I was just curious because I know a lot of Jewish people were communists from the East Coast. Okay.
Yeah, but no. Well, our friend Hal was Jewish, and he'd become a communist at 16. But you might, communism, apparently, I don't know that much about it. I've never read the manifesto. I don't know. But it sounds like, ideally, it would be a very good system.
Yeah, of course.
Everybody it wouldn't be any disparity.
Sure.
Economically, everybody would share stuff.
Yeah, it sounds utopian.
Yeah, it is utopian, and it never works because you got communists. I mean, you've got dictators.
Exactly. You have the ego of humans.
Right. You've always got somebody who's got to be more equal than others.
Exactly.
As Orwell
right.
said.
So they basically negate the whole tenet of it.
Exactly. So, especially if you grow up poor, you think.
Sure. Why not have everyone? Why shouldn't everyone have the same? Yeah. Right.
But,
wow.
Anyway.
So your general impression, I know that probably your least favorite decade is the 50s.
Yeah, the 50s.
And
wait a minute, what time is it?
Is it 20 after 11? A quarter after 11?
Yeah, jeez.
Let's just quickly wrap up. Just why you do not like the 50s. There's obviously that.
Well, it was boring. I mean, the clothes were boring. The music was. That's when rock and roll started, and I never liked rock and roll. I thought Elvis Presley was yucky, and it was just bland, very bland. People were bland. People weren't interesting. The movies weren't very good. It was just not a good time. I mean, just
no
boring.
Interesting books.
It
really?
wasn't dangerous or anything. It was just boring and bland.
Yeah, sleepy.
And
complacent.
Yeah. I guess it's the time everybody wants to go back to.
Right. Yeah. Well, but then as I've often hear people say that, the 50s, what a great time. Like, my own
if you're
daughter.
White, middle class.
Exactly. If you're heterosexual and male white, that was sure. I'm sure it was a great time.
Yeah.
Although I bet if you talked to a lot of those men, they might not even.
Well, it was the story. It was the decade of the men in the gray flannel suit. That was a perfect example of it. Like the ad agency people, and it was a male-dominated but dreary time for many men too.
Sure, I imagine it would be. Sure,
because
they
had to
shunted into this role,
and then the women were these little, leave it to beaver moms. Although I never knew anyone who wore pearls around the house.
Right. I remember you saying that women did not dress in little poofy skirts.
No, they never did.
You were what were you wearing in the 50s? Jeans.
Yeah.
Dungarees, did you call them, or is that a
jeans? I don't know what we call them. I don't know,
but you were a beatnik. Well, not a beatnik. You were.
Audrey Sylvester and I were the hippie chicks of the Baldwin Wallace with our black tights and long hair and.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wish we had some photos from that.
Yeah.
Because after Daddy got his master's thesis taken care of and got his master's, then he went on to Baldwin Wallace College in Berea, Ohio.
Right.
Correct?
Well, he was working on his doctorate when he got the job at BW.
Oh, I didn't realize he was working on it already.
Yeah.
Wow.
He had everything in place, but they used to say, "Well, take a year off and teach for a while." Well.
His master's thesis was about that.
The guineas.
The guineas.
Yeah. His doctoral thesis was about the acculturation of Appalachian people into, urban society.
Specifically,
because Akron had been the capital of West Virginia. People came up from Kentucky and West Virginia for rubber company jobs in the teens and 20s and wanted to see how. And still, you'd pick up a paper in the obituaries, they'd go back to West Virginia to be buried,
Mm-hmm.
And he just wanted to see how many generations would it take for they just to be Ohioans.
Oh, just to be assimilated.
Yeah, assimilated into the culture. So he didn't get the chance to actually do it, because he did all the preparation.
Right, right.
But he taught at BW, and then at a little college like that, can't just teach beginning SOS. You got to get, and he had to do all these different preparations. He loved it,
Yeah.
and he did very well. He was honored as one of the favorite teachers there, and but it was a lot of work, and plus having kids.
Sure, at this point
Yeah,
you'd had
yeah.
at least 2 kids. Right.
And not only that, the only other guy in the social department was an idiot who just gave everybody an A if they showed up. Because
Oh.
your dad liked to talk to people. He liked discussions,
Right.
And he had, Pete Sylvester in the philosophy department was a good friend. And who else did he hang out with up there? Nobody. I mean, it was just Pete and John, and I think another guy, John Barbarelli or something like that, who was in the philosophy department.
And this is when he sort of first got involved in civil rights, correct?
Right, right.
And what
yeah.
was the
he
what
tried
was the
to integrate
issue?
a skating rink,
Right.
and he got into trouble because it made the front lines of the headlines in the local
Right.
paper. And he'd been promised tenure after I think after 2 years or something, and good marks as a teacher, et cetera. So they refused him tenure. And then the offer came here, so we
Right.
left.
But just tell me really briefly about the protest he sort
Well,
of
what they
staged.
did is they took a mixed group of people to the skating rink. And Baldwin Wallace had a number of black students, all of whom were extremely good, successful, and when they left there.
And this is all incidentally closer to Cleveland we're talking about, just to
Right,
the
it's on the
area.
west side of Cleveland, southwest of Cleveland. Anyway, so they went to the skating rink, and the white kids got up, got their tickets, and when the first black kid that came up, sorry, this is membership only. And your father, who had already gotten his ticket, said, I'm not a member. And the other kid said, we're not members. And the guy said, well, I'm sorry, it's just one of those, well, I don't know how he dealt with it.
Yeah.
But it was very, very obvious that they were discriminating against black students.
And did he know this in advance? Was
yeah.
he doing that?
Oh,
He
that's
did this
why
as
he
a
did
test.
It was all proof
Sure.
that they're discriminating.
Did
They were saying, we're not discriminating.
And had someone told him in advance that a black kid tried to skate there and that they were denied? And is that why he got the group to go?
I think so, yeah.
Okay,
Because
yeah.
they were told it was membership only.
Right.
But all these white people in this line
Yeah.
went right in, were able to go right in if they wanted to. And then first black kid was membership only. And all the white people said, we're not members.
And what happened after that?
Well, it made the paper, and I don't remember if they then started opening it up.
Mm-hmm.
But the black kids on campus had to go into Cleveland to get their damn hair cut. They couldn't get their hair cut in Berea.
And
well,
we're talking.
the hair is different. Well,
We're talking.
1950s, let's see, probably was born in 56, it was 57 or 58.
Late 50s, yeah.
Way before the Civil Rights Act was
Sure,
passed.
yeah, this is early days.
And we'd have these girls come over, we really like Regina, and we'd like to have her in our sorority, but she's black. And we don't know what to do. And I said, take her. Well, we can't because the alumni would just be really upset with us. Well, then don't. Then just live with it,
Must
If
have
you
been
like
very,
her so damn much.
right, must have
but
been
she's
very frustrating to watch.